All right, so let's start off with our first question. And to start off thinking about what these concepts are, what we are really talking about is something called welfare economics. And this goes way back to somebody named Jeremy Bentham, who came up with this philosophy of utilitarianism, where he thought that it should be society's goal to maximize everybody's well-being in terms of utility. So this is where these things have their roots is in his philosophy of utilitarianism. But it's basically welfare economics is basically the study of how the allocation of resources affects economic well-being, whether for individuals or for a market or for even an economy as a whole. And so what we're talking about is societal welfare and trying to maximize it. And so there's basically two components of societal welfare, and that's consumer surplus and producer surplus. So basically just corresponding to the different sides of the market, consumer surplus coming from the demand side and producer surplus coming from the supply side of the market. But they're basically just measures of value, measures of market value. Okay, so it provides us with a way of measuring welfare in a market. So to think about what consumer surplus is, let's start by thinking about suppose that there were three students who had different willingnesses to pay, or WTPs, for a textbook. And as it turns out, this corresponds with their own demands for this textbook. Willingness to pay and demand are basically the same thing. So we've got three students, Beanie, Mitch, and Frank, each with their own willingnesses to pay. And Beanie has the highest willingness to pay. He would pay up to $200 for the textbook. Mitch would be willing to pay up to $150 for the textbook, and Frank has the lowest willingness to pay. He would only be willing to pay up to $100 for the textbook. So if you, if I asked you who would buy the textbook if the price was $140, well, it's pretty straightforward. Anybody whose willingness to pay is at least $140 or greater. So in that case, it would be Beanie and Mitch. Frank would not be willing to buy this book at the price of $140. His highest willingness to pay is $100. So only Beanie and Mitch would end up buying the book. So we can use these numbers to calculate the consumer's surplus, each consumer's surplus. And it's simply the difference between their willingness to pay and the actual price that they pay. So since Beanie, for example, is willing to pay $200, it's another way to think about it is the value of the book to Beanie, the textbook, the value of that textbook to Beanie is $200. And that's why he is willing to pay up to as much as $200 for the textbook, because he values it at $200. So when he purchases it for $140, he's basically getting an excess of $60 of value. You can almost think of it this way: since he's willing to pay $200 for it, suppose he had two $100 bills in his pocket ready to buy this textbook, and he goes into the bookstore to buy it, and it's only $140. So he walks out with the textbook, which is worth $200 to him, but he also walks out of the store with $60 in change. So now in total, he walked into the store with $200 cash, and he walks out of the store with $260 worth of stuff. A $200 book, it's worth $200 to him, and then he walks out with the $60 cash. So he's somehow gained through this transaction $60 of value, basically. And that's what consumer surplus is. It's a measurement of the value that the consumer has gained by purchasing something. Mitch, on the other hand, had a lower willingness to pay. The value of the textbook to Mitch was only $150. And so Mitch only gains $10 by buying the book at a price of $140. And again, you can think of it, Mitch walks in with $150 in his pocket, because that's what he's willing to spend on the textbook. It's what it's worth to him. And when he walks out, he has the textbook that's worth $150, but he also walks out with $10 cash in change. So the $10 is the consumer surplus for Mitch. Frank doesn't buy the book, so he doesn't get to benefit at all. He doesn't have any consumer surplus since Frank doesn't buy the book. So we can look at this graphically, and just like I said, the willingness to pay is basically the demand curve. Here it's illustrated as a stepwise function, so we haven't really seen this yet, but I think I may have mentioned this early in the semester, how in real life we can't buy half of a Big Mac, for example. So in real life, demand curves are stepwise functions. They look like stairs. And so that's what we have here. And so the highest step is, of course, Beanie with his $200 willingness to pay. The second step is $150 for Mitch, his willingness to pay. And then the lowest step is Frank and his willingness to pay. Okay, so we are assuming that these three guys are the only people in the market for this textbook. So there's the market demand curve, the market stepwise function. All right. And so here we see it graphically. Now this graph, we are assuming that the price of the book is no longer $140, but it is now $175. So in that case, if the price of the book was $175, Beanie would be the only one to buy it. Okay. Neither Mitch nor who's the other person? Frank. Neither Mitch nor Frank would buy the book if it was $175. The only person that would buy it would be Beanie. And his consumer surplus in this case would be $25, which is the difference between his willingness to pay and what he actually has to pay for the book. And it's represented by this light blue area here. So not only can we calculate it using finding the difference between willingness to pay and price, but we can also visualize it graphically as an area. Okay, so the area of that rectangle, that light blue rectangle, is 25 because its height is 25 and its width is 1. 1 times 25 is 25. Now, if the price of the book dropped to $125, now Mitch would be willing to buy it, as well as Beanie. And Beanie's consumer surplus would be $75. And Mitch's consumer surplus would be $25, and the total market's consumer surplus would be $100, just adding up their individual consumer surpluses. And again, it would be represented as those areas there that are shaded blue, light blue. Mitch's consumer surplus is a slightly darker blue.